The end of the Civil War marked the conclusion of slavery for 4 million black Southerners. However, it also left them without land and with limited financial resources to support themselves. In response, white Southerners, seeking to control the newly freed slaves, developed specific state law codes known as the Southern Black Codes. To comprehend these black codes, we must revisit the aftermath of the Civil War. With the Confederacy defeated and slavery abolished, millions of African Americans suddenly found themselves liberated from bondage. Yet, mere freedom did not guarantee their rights and equality. The Southern states, previously slave-owning, were determined to maintain white supremacy and prevent black Americans from acquiring political, economic, and social power. This is where the Black Codes come into play. These state laws aim to govern and restrain the behavior of the newly freed slaves. Although the specifics of the Black Codes varied from state to state, they shared a common objective: to enforce a system of racial segregation and subordination. Their purpose was to curtail the rights of black Americans, including the right to vote, own property, testify in court, or even move freely. The period following the Civil War was marked by turmoil, with the Southern states in ruins and the nation struggling to recover. Newly emancipated black Americans found themselves in a precarious situation, thrust into a hostile and unwelcoming world. Shortly after the war's end, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food, medical assistance, and educational opportunities to former slaves. By 1870, 250,000 black individuals, both children and adults, attended over 4,000 of these schools in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau also worked to ensure fair wages and the freedom of choice for former slaves in the workplace. Special courts were set up to settle disputes between black workers and their white employers. Despite these efforts, white Southerners resented being ruled by Union military governors and Freedmen's Bureau officials. They sought to restore self-rule in the South. During the summer and fall of 1865, most of the former Confederate states held constitutional conventions. President Andrew Johnson, favoring the rapid readmission of the Southern states into the Union, permitted only white individuals to vote for convention delegates and participate in framing new state governments. Not surprisingly, none of the state conventions considered extending voting rights to freedmen. By the end of the year, elections under the new state constitutions had taken place in most of the South. Ex-Confederate leaders often won these elections, both for state government positions and U.S. Congress seats. The newly formed state legislatures quickly authorized various public projects, financed through taxes. However, public schools excluded black children, and laws were passed to limit the freedom of former slaves. These laws closely resembled those from colonial times, imposing severe restrictions on both slaves and emancipated black individuals. Voting, serving on juries, traveling freely, choosing occupations, and even marriages were heavily regulated, with discrimination deeply ingrained. The prevailing white Southern perspective at the time was that fundamental differences between white and black races justified unequal treatment. One of the rumors that circulated was that the federal government would grant 40 acres and a mule to every ex-slave family on Christmas Day. While some Confederate lands were indeed confiscated and given to freed slaves, this was not planned on a large scale. Nonetheless, many black individuals refused to sign work contracts with white landowners for the new year, while white Southerners spread rumors that blacks would rise in rebellion when the promised land failed to materialize. These economic concerns, prejudices, and fears played a role in the creation of the first Black Codes in 1865. These codes consisted of specific laws applicable only to black individuals. Mississippi's initial Black Code was particularly harsh, and South Carolina followed with a slightly less severe but more comprehensive set of regulations governing the lives of black Americans. South Carolina's Black Code defined persons of color as individuals with more than 1/8 Negro blood. While these Black Codes did grant some civil rights to freedmen, such as property ownership, contract rights, protection under the law, recognition of marriages, and legitimacy of their children, they also declared interracial marriages illegal and void. One of the most troubling aspects of the Black Codes was how they restricted black Americans' employment opportunities. Black workers were often forced into labor contracts that heavily favored white employers, leading to extremely low wages and precarious job security. These contracts sometimes mandated that black workers live on their employer's property, with eviction as a consequence for refusal to work or contract violations. These labor contracts effectively resembled indentured servitude, exploiting black workers and maintaining economic dependence on white employers. In some cases, these contracts were enforced through violence and intimidation. Among the most egregious aspects of the black codes were their utilization of vagrancy laws. These laws made it a crime to be unemployed or unable to prove employment, leading to the arrest and imprisonment of numerous black Americans who were merely seeking work. Many of these incarcerated individuals were subsequently leased to private companies as a source of cheap labor, essentially creating a new form of slavery in everything but name. Notably, white offenders were usually exempted from such penalties and could instead take an oath of poverty. South Carolina's Black Code also introduced a racially segregated court system for cases involving black plaintiffs or defendants. While it allowed black witnesses to testify in court, this privilege only applied to cases concerning personal property of a person of color. Crimes perceived as potential actions by freedmen, such as rebellion, arson, burglary, or assault on a white woman, carried severe penalties, often including the death penalty for black individuals, but not for whites. Minor offenses committed by blacks could result in punishments like being hired out or subjected to whipping, penalties rarely imposed on white lawbreakers. Additionally, black codes barred black Americans from owning firearms, serving on juries, and effectively denied them access to justice or the ability to defend themselves. These laws also imposed harsh penalties on African Americans for minor offenses such as loitering, vagrancy, or even making insulting gestures, with these offenses often defined broadly. The Black Codes enacted in Mississippi and South Carolina in 1865 triggered significant outrage among many Northerners, who accused Southern whites of attempting to reinstate slavery. Consequently, Congress refused to admit Southerners elected under the new state constitutions, and a special congressional committee investigated the continuation of white Southern Reconstruction. Ultimately, the Black Codes in Mississippi and South Carolina were invalidated by the Union military governors and the Freedmen's Bureau, who feared a threat to self-rule. As Christmas Day of that year arrived without the anticipated land for freedmen or the feared rebellion, labor contracts were signed across the South, and conditions became less tense. In 1866, most other former Confederate states enacted black codes with more attention to legal equality between whites and blacks. Other events also influenced the course of Reconstruction, including the passage of the 14th Amendment, a shift in Congress's control, President Johnson's impeachment, and the election of new state conventions. These conventions, held in 1867 and 1868, allowed freedmen to vote and participate in creating new state constitutions. These constitutions guaranteed the voting and candidacy rights of black adult males, leading to some black individuals winning elections to Southern state legislatures and Congress. However, Reconstruction was relatively short-lived, and by 1877, it had effectively ended. The North's interest in supporting Southern black citizens waned, and various factors, including economic troubles, a more conservative national consensus, a belief in Reconstruction's failure, the resurgence of the Democratic Party, and a growing acceptance of racist attitudes, contributed to its demise. By 1910, all Southern states had effectively excluded blacks from voting, and in the 1890s, new forms of black codes, known as Jim Crow laws, were enacted. These laws made it illegal for blacks and whites to share public facilities, leading to segregation in schools, hospitals, libraries, restaurants, hotels, bathrooms, and drinking fountains. By the early 1880s, larger Southern cities were less beholden to Jim Crow laws, prompting significant black populations to move there. However, this movement also led to the demand for more laws limiting opportunities for African Americans. Jim Crow laws spread across the country, enforcing segregation in parks, theaters, restaurants, waiting rooms, bus and train stations, water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, and even amusement park cashier windows. Moreover, these laws banned interracial marriage and cohabitation, and included whites-only signs in businesses. Despite the oppressive nature of the Jim Crow era, it was also a time when many African Americans emerged as leaders, vigorously opposing these discriminatory laws. Figures like Ida B. Wells and Charlotte Hawkins Brown played significant roles in this fight. Others, believing that peaceful coexistence was impossible due to Jim Crow laws, pursued a separatist approach, like Isaiah Montgomery, who established the all-African American town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi, in 1887. As the 20th century unfolded, Jim Crow laws persisted amid an oppressive society marked by violence. The Great Migration of the 1920s saw educated black individuals leaving the South for better opportunities in the North. The post-World War II period witnessed a rise in civil rights activities, with a focus on securing black citizens' voting rights. This ultimately led to the Civil Rights Movement and the end of Jim Crow laws in the 1960s, as well as the dismantling of segregation and discrimination in various aspects of American life.